Hello friends, and welcome to another A Tanker's View, or as I'm probably going to start calling it from here on out, A Tanker's Review. At the behest of some lovely subscribers, I'm going to review Peter Jackson's 2018 They Shall Not Grow Old. Now, if you don't know who Peter Jackson is, please let me know in the comments down below where you are, so I too can achieve that level of peace and quiet in my life. Now, from the outset, like my All Quiet on the Western Front review, I will not focus on cinematography, aspect ratios, lighting, or anything of that nature. There are far better, far more talented YouTubers out there who can pick apart the technical aspects of the film. I am just going to look at several parts of this that stand out to me as a soldier and as a combat veteran. A brief overview of this film, I believe, is in order to pay the proper respect to the work and dedication that went into making this. It is approximately an hour and 50 minutes, mostly color restored World War I documentary footage. There's no grand narration. There's no overarching story. Just the words spoken by themselves who were there, laid over the brutal reality of what these men faced on screen. I will endeavor to keep my points as salient and at a decent flowing pace, but with this material it is difficult not to get emotional, as I'm sure more than some of you can empathize. So, this opens as most documentaries do, with soldiers gifted with hindsight talking about how they were often socially coerced by way of government propaganda. Now, a quick aside here. This is not done with any intention of disrespecting the soldiers that actually served. When I level criticism at the film's content, it is aimed solely at the governments responsible. But without trying to sound too conspiratorial, governments often lie to achieve their aims. This is extremely evident when these men discuss how they were signed on. Most were told stories of glory and adventure. Most of these young men had no experience and were not well traveled, and, well, quite frankly, often came from lower and working class neighborhoods. Men and women who had never left a locality often more than once in their life. I have touched on this subject before, but most of my audience should have a similar event within living memory. How hard were we all propagandized post 9/11? Patriotism, flag waving, and the accompanying jingoism of us versus them. Again, this is not a political breakdown, but merely a point of reference, so you may understand the similarities of what these men faced, and really only that. I trust most of you are of sound enough mind to make up your own judgments on how a government chooses to disseminate information to its people. I am not here to make that judgment for you. Carrying on with the type of opening that is so very common in this type of documentary is the footage of the new men in uniform struggling to adapt to the rigors of military life, learning how to march, dress, carry a weapon, so on and so forth, the things that go on part and parcel of being a soldier. And it's kind of distressing to see the smiles and laughters on the face of these men. They really do have no idea what they're in for. The innocence and ignorance of the horrors that they're soon going to face. It was stark contrast to how the men looked and sounded later on in comparison to these events that will take place. Now, I want to say that it's almost required to put this in, but it gives a solid foundation to empathize with what these men lost. Now, with the obvious start to this review out of the way, I'll give you the bread and butter of this issue. Soldiers complaining about their rations. And boy howdy, how can every soldier since time immemorial relate? I knew when I was a young private once I could relate, and I had a particular sergeant tell me, when troops stop complaining, officers get nervous. To illustrate the point in this film, several cartoons are shown of soldiers complaining when all they receive is plum and apple jam for their bread. Now, I get that there's going to be some civilians who think, gee, they're getting jam with their bread. I don't even get jam with my bread every day. What's the problem here? Now, I want you to think of it like this. I want you to take your favorite food, and only your favorite food, one brand, no substitutions. You can eat that at a regimented time, 3 times per day, every day, no substitutions. You can't swap it out for anything else. How fast would you get sick of that food? Just something to put in the back of your heads. To give you an idea, there once was a time before Afghanistan in which I used to love apple cinnamon Pop-Tarts. I can tell you that time has long since passed. It's nice to see this because it gives a real look into the basic things soldiers can be deprived of, something we take for granted every day in our own world, something as simple as choice. And the soldier, well, he just has to suck it up and do it anyway. This little window into the daily routine of things that are ingrained into him as a soldier. If he does the routine every day, like everyone else, maybe it won't be him that day. But really he knows in his heart of hearts that if he doesn't want to be the reason his best friend gets his ticket punched because he didn't do what he was supposed to do. We all feared it. Some of us still live with it. The survivor's guilt, that little voice in the back of our dreams and all of our thoughts that tells us it should have been you. You hear it, the pain, the stutter, the subtle choke in their voices when those memories just intrude. I know it still catches me and a lot of vets that I talk to still. And this is where this review is going to take probably a much darker turn, and well, rightly so, because the film itself takes a stark turn as the conditions move towards the conditions of the front line. These aren't sweeping vistas and panoramic beauty shots done with drones and cranes under pristine conditions. These aren't arranged props. These are static shots from tripods on the ground. They are visceral, they are brutal, and they do not hide anything. I had to switch this off several times when I was watching it, and I will obviously not show these images on YouTube for, again, obvious reasons. In the film, we're shown several things and several shots of no man's land I think that everyone should really just take in. The impersonal and hopeless nature of warfare is on full display. A German undermine is blown open, artillery striking the field. To add to this, several depictions of airburst artillery. It almost seems clinical being seen from such a distance, but overlaid and giving it the gravitas is the soldiers describing the horrendous effects such shelling has. And I remember my first experience with airburst artillery myself. I wasn't on the receiving end, obviously. It was a pre-deployment exercise, and we were prepping in a town for an assault, and you could watch the wisps of smoke in the air. And if you weren't entranced by that too much and you focused on the ground in front of you, you could see the walls and the roofs being torn apart by supersonic chunks of steel the size of your hand. You were wondering as you watched it, with the rhythmic thump-thump of the artillery guns still going off, dropping more ordnance, how could you endure? Could you endure? Would you have the will to endure that and still want to fight? And realistically, none of us could answer that question until we're there. And continuing onwards with this subject, some of the soldiers made mention of NCOs and officers attempting to keep calm during the ranks on the receipt of German bombardment. And one thing stood out to me was a soldier recounting how a sergeant was ordering a man who was clearly not cut out for combat to be shot. Because we've read the histories and accounts, we know what happened in an academic sense, but to watch such callous disregard for the welfare of those under your command sickens me as a soldier and as a father. To think, God forbid, if I had to send my children to war, the treatment they've received is that of little more than cannon fodder. And as a parent and a human being, it breaks my heart that these children, that's exactly what many of them were, lied, children who lied about their age to go to war, children who were lied to by the state and charged, and those charged with their care who should have known better. These children were terrified, out of their element, and for the vast majority of them, their first time away from home. And instead of taking the time to think or even show the slightest form of empathy, they were often shot for cowardice. Let that sink in. Kids, children, teenagers, barely out of school, couldn't even shave, being shot as cowards and deserters for finally realizing that they had been lied to. And this is going to segue into my second to last point. The sadness, the tears heard in the men's voices as they recount the wounded and dying, the quavering in their voices as they told of wounded being unable to be rescued because the mud had swallowed them almost whole. Actually, you know what? At the risk of the copyright claim,
a shell had hit this man. It knocked off his left arm, it knocked off his left leg, his left eye hanging on his cheek, and he's calling out for Nanny. His bleeding eye was hanging on, pulsing. So I shot him. I had to shoot him. He'd have died in any case, and it put him out of his misery. But it hurt me.
If you can listen to that and not be moved, I wonder what has gone so wrong in your life. I don't want to dwell on this point so much. It's something a civilian will never know, having to administer mercy, and I hope to God no one's ever put in a position to make that choice. It is probably going to be one of the hardest things you'd ever have to live with. and these men often had to continue to live with it. And the final point I want to bring up about my review here is how the soldiers were counted coming home. Every soldier's dream and dread to go from a high-intensity, regimented life to, oh well, fighting's done, drop your shit at the barracks, get your suit, and get the F out of here. And it would appear our experience is really as old as time. Called up to serve and discarded as soon as the danger's passed. Unable to even parlay what you've seen and done in a way that a civilian would understand. Oh sure, you're told thanks for your service, now please go elsewhere. The pitying looks of wounded and maimed soldiers. Boys now made broken men with no support, no jobs, no hope for the future. A bleak outlook and a harsh look at how society treats those it no longer needs. And in the end, they really only had each other, and a lot of times it wasn't enough. I know in recent years we've tried to do better, in an age where mental health is coming to the forefront. But could you imagine the levels of isolation, dread, and attendant feelings to go with survivor's guilt and severe and undiagnosed and untreated PTSD? And no one who's supposed to be able to help you can understand what you're going through. So in conclusion, I can really think of several ways to describe this film. Poignant, beautiful, eye-opening, and very, very painful. And that pain isn't expressed through masterful storytelling or drama, but by words and voices of those who participated, by the brutal, morbid reality of what they faced, and the hope and the words and wisdom would shape a better world to come, one where their children will never feel the biting sting of war and loss. And this, in my opinion, may be the greatest work that Peter Jackson's ever done, and a somber reminder of things fading from living memory. So we aren't doomed to repeat these mistakes again. But the sad reality is these words are probably going to fall on deaf ears. But we can hope if only one person listens, that might be enough.